Yellow paint discourse is back. Like a red cape to a bull, something about splashes of yellow pointing the way in a game elicits a response akin to if the game itself had thrown yellow paint over a close family member. Everyone gets super confused and angry about it, and the prevailing question is usually, why? The latest chapter in the yellow paint discourse is all thanks to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and specifically the demo that dropped for the game last week. During a mountain climbing section, Cloud approaches a rocky surface with shining yellow edges, letting the player know in no uncertain terms that yes, this is the way to go. You can interact with this ledge. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, Elliot, I've heard this argument before. Well spotted, my astute viewer, because this is far from the only time the gaming community as a whole has had this discussion over the last decade. You can track the yellow paint discourse back a fair way, somewhere around 2007, if you dig far enough, when Naughty Dog arguably popularised the bright yellow approach with Uncharted. But this latest round of endless arguments between two sides who never listened to each other actually started somewhere around the Resident Evil 4 remake demo, which came complete with yellow signposting paint on boxes, ledges and more, was edited out by modders, and then pissed off a whole other subsection of people when it was in the full game. It can be easy to see this debate as a loud minority of players on social media screaming merrily into the void, and often these debates lack the nuance required to really talk about them constructively. It's lazy game design and makes the game feel like a series of signposts, one side will say. It's better for accessibility, and gamers are notoriously bad at following directions, especially when they're explicitly told what to do, cries the other. But, and I appreciate trying to once again slide myself perfectly balanced onto the middle of the fence is perhaps an even more difficult manoeuvre than it's ever been. Games need to show you exactly what is interactable because otherwise it would be a monumental chore to work it out. And yellow paint is a bit of a lazy solution and there are better ways to do it, and not phrases that are or should be mutually exclusive. Both of these can be and are very much true. Let us take a moment to regale ourselves of exactly why game designers have to think about these things in the first place. Playtesters, and by extension all of us who regularly play games, are guilty of maybe not outright stupidity, although I'm sure there's a long list of games that would disagree with me after throwing me a hint every 10 minutes, after I spend way too long jumping in the same spot because I can't work out where to go next, but at least tunnel vision when it comes to games. Let us not pretend that we do not occasionally need a helpful guiding hand to point us in the right direction. It's a famous anecdote nowadays, but it's widely accepted that players will very rarely, unless given an explicit reason to do so, look up. In fact, even when told to look up, they'll still do their best not to unless it becomes clear it's the only way forward. During Portal's development, the devs were frequently required to adjust the positions of exit portals when playtesters steadfastly refused to use the Y-axis and glance at the ceiling, having to find solutions like putting portals on moving pistons that occasionally cycled the exit into a standard player's POV so that they would eventually find their way out. This is, in its basest form, placing yellow paint around an exit portal. But because it fits within the story, the world, and most importantly, fits the context of the level, this is generally considered good game design, not bad. Then there's the Dead Space story, how playtesters, despite numerous audio logs making it clear that lopping off a necromorph's limbs is the best way to secure a kill and stay alive, would simply revert to decades of muscle memory and go for headshots, especially under pressure, which, to be fair, is probably the response you want in a survival horror, but led directly to the giant cut off their limbs plastered to the wall in blood when Isaac gets his hand on the plasma cutter for the first time. This is, once again, considered by the naysayers of yellow paint, good game design. Never mind that it's as subtle as a plasma cut around to the face, it fits into the world, in a manner of speaking, and is a little different than placing big red auras around enemy limbs. And then of course you have the more recent classic Jump story. Game designer Dave Lockman shared that he once developed a game where you can only jump and any button makes you jump. Fairly self-explanatory, you would have thought, until it was exposed to all of us out in the public, and while at a PAX show, even with a giant button in front of the screen with jump emblazoned in massive letters across it, how do you jump was still one of the more common questions that the devs were asked. Making things stand out in the world then is important. It means that players can actively understand how to engage with the world you've built for them. But this yellow paint discourse has thrown the whole practice for a loop. Let's not pretend that things were necessarily better in the good old days either, as some rose-tinted spectacle wearers in the social media comments would have you believe. To reference the big yellow elephant in the room, Resident Evil 4 Remake, hell, even Village, may have resorted to whacking swathes of yellow paint all over the shop to show players what they could break, but the original Resident Evil 4 wasn't exactly subtle with it. Breakable boxes might as well have been painted yellow for how much they practically glowed against the background of unbreakable terrain. I apologise if yellow paint breaks your immersion, perhaps you'd rather each box come with a free set of glow sticks instead. Now, you may have listened to the last few minutes and assume that I am therefore in favour of the yellow paint in games. All of these things I've said can be true, and yet you can still think that yellow paint to highlight interactable edges and items is a little bit of a cop-out. It's a fair criticism. There are of course ways we can sympathise with the devs who ultimately turn to this traversal crutch to highlight to players where they need to go. Plenty of games that turn to the pots of yellow paint every developer keeps in a locked cupboard for just such an occasion are generally massive marvels of game development, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth seems to be. And the cruel fact of the crunch culture the games industry too often finds itself in is that chucking a garish and easy to spot splash of paint at the situation is the easiest way to guide people. And to be fair to Resident Evil 4 Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth et al., other games have successfully used the yellow paint bit and managed to fit it into their world, or built their lore to incorporate it. God of War and Phase Path come to mind, all the climbable surfaces and jumpable gaps made clear by Atreus' mother long before we ever walked the path, because she can see into the future and knew that I would keep messing that one puzzle up. Or the Uncharted series, indeed one of the first to truly take the yellow paint approach to traversal and make it into a viable mechanic. All the while fitting the yellow bits into more man-made structures like pipes or signs, and instead reverting to that weird sticky out texture for climbable natural surfaces. A technique that if Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had decided to run with, you have to imagine we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But it's proof that the yellow paint approach doesn't have to be immersion breaking to even the most steadfast lover of impossible to navigate but hyper-realistic game environments. Speaking of making things harder to navigate, one of the biggest criticisms launched at the yellow paint brigade every time this discussion comes around again is that this kind of level design limits exploration, takes the mystery out of where to go, and encourages players to skip the optional areas in favour of a never-ending march towards the next story cutscene. To which I would say, yeah, fair enough. There's a temptation to assume that these yellow paint traversal sections are little more than a glorified loading screen, asking nothing of the player short of jumping on the ledge and pushing forward on your left analog stick. Games, or more specifically AAA action-adventure games that most often lean on the yellow plastered walking stick, have moved away from exploration, challenging puzzles and engaging platforming as a general rule, instead choosing this one-size-fits-all approach to making your way around levels that pretty much anyone with working thumbs could traverse. Now, games that do this are often accused of appealing to the lowest common denominator, the one playtester who didn't work out that the exit was actually above them. But that's not always a bad thing. Ultimately, you want people to play your game, and one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that, to use that most sacred of phrases, gaming bullshit, like getting lost on your way to the next mission, doesn't actually stand in anyone's way of enjoying the game you are actually trying to make. There is also, of course, the argument for accessibility. Games have come a long way in that regard, but it seems a bit rich to assign the throwing of yellow paint around a location the label of accessibility feature. It is, after all, in its simplest form, little more than signposting, and certainly not worthy of the praise that actual accessibility features deserve. Say what you like about The Last of Us 2, but it put a lot more work into making sure that as many people as possible could enjoy the game than simply chucking a paint pot around an exit every few encounters. Let's at least try and make sure that credit is only given when it's actually due. All of this to say that in the end, the yellow paint discourse may not even matter that much, at least in the context of Rebirth. It's present in a very scripted demo for the game, designed to give players a broad overview of what to expect, and there's a chance it barely seeps into the landscape of Rebirth's world at all, let alone becomes a vital crutch that we'll be relying on to get around. And yet, this discourse raises its ugly head like a clockwork hydra every 6 months or so, and thus, Elliot, I hear you cry, you've waffled on for the last 8 minutes of my life, what's the solution? Let's get some proper answers here. And ultimately, I think it comes down to letting people do whatever they bloody well please. One of the best examples of pushing exactly how much help is required onto the players was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which let players decide how obvious they wanted these environmental clues to be. Or if they were truly sick of the yellow paint discourse, they could switch them off entirely and enjoy the misery of working out where to go in their hyper-realistic environments like they always wanted. Maybe attaching these kind of visual hints to a difficulty level, or something like that, would help to alleviate some of the issues. It wouldn't stop people complaining, of course, but it might give us all a bit of a break to focus on the other controversies that we love screaming into the void about. The other option, of course, is giving devs more time to ground their games with the understanding that level design clues will be built more organically into the worlds they create. Unrealistic? Yeah, perhaps. But no one ever actually said games had to be realistic now, did they? What do you make of the yellow paint discourse? If you agree, disagree, or love sitting on the fence as much as yours truly, we would love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stuff like this, and while we have you here at GG Recon, why not check out our actual thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? without all this yellow paint flying around.